Hi everyone, and welcome to our session today. So what we are going to now have a look at is the effects of a tectonic hazard, in this case an earthquake, but on specific locations. And we're going to be talking about New Zealand, probably my favourite country in the whole world, and Nepal. So at least they both start with the same letter, so that should help you to remember it. Now, what you will need for today's session, please, is a pen and a pencil. You will need a ruler because I am going to ask you to draw a table and obviously something to write on, so piece of paper or a notebook. Now, please, can I ask you, turn your phone off, shut the door, make sure you are somewhere nice and quiet. This is going to be an awesome lesson. I love looking at case studies, so we're going to have a really good time and make sure you're ready. Okay, so let's make a start on today's lesson. And as I said, what we're going to be looking at is the effects of earthquakes, but in two contrasting locations. So we're going to have a look at New Zealand and we're going to have a look at Nepal. So say this word after me, Nepal. Okay, good, because that is often something that students struggle with pronouncing, Nepal. Right, please can I ask you to write the title. Make sure that you've got capital letters for New Zealand and Nepal. They're both names. And then if you could underline the title, because hopefully you have a ruler ready for our table drawing, and then we'll get on. Okay, so essentially what we're going to be looking at is the way that tectonic hazards affect contrasting countries. And when I say contrasting countries, what I'm talking about is countries that are more developed and countries that are less developed. And some of the language we might use around this would be a high income country or a low income country. Now, the effect of an earthquake can be different depending on a country's level of wealth. And essentially, higher income countries, they're often better prepared for natural hazards, and therefore the effects can be less significant. Not always, that isn't always the case, but as a general rule and a pattern, that can be what we find. Then we have our low income countries. Now, often low income countries have a higher population density. And as a result of that, that can increase their vulnerability. And we looked at vulnerability in one of our previous sessions. And actually, we looked at that relationship between the more people there are living in one place, the more likely they are to suffer the effects of a natural hazard. So again, we're going to look at this photograph because this photograph was taken after the earthquake in Nepal. Now, Nepal, for our case study today, is going to be our example of a low-income country, and New Zealand is going to be our example of a high-income country. And essentially, what I'm going to get you to do is to compare the effects of the earthquake in New Zealand with the effects of the earthquake in Nepal, and decide which one you think has had the most significant effect. So, what I would like you to do, please, first of all, is this. Have a look at these two photographs. So the first photograph is a place called Kaikoura or Kaikoura. That is in New Zealand. Say it after me, Kaikoura. Now, Kaikoura in New Zealand is a fairly small town. And as you can see, it is not very densely populated. There are spaces between each of the houses. It's spread out along the coastline, but it's not particularly densely populated. If we then compare that to the photograph on the right, that photograph shows us where the earthquake affected Nepal. And you can see, just from the types of the buildings, they're multiple stories, which means there's probably lots of families living in each of those buildings. So I would like you to decide which one of those you think is likely to experience the most significant effect of a natural hazard. So imagine the hazard were almost exactly the same. Okay, so I'm hoping that all of you are saying out loud Nepal. So Nepal is the place where we think would have the most significant impacts. Now, what we're going to do is test that theory over the course of today's session. So, first of all, I'm going to show you a grid that has some key facts and statistics about each country. Okay, so before I show you those key facts, it's actually really important that we draw a table so that we can collate and collect all of the information that we need today about New Zealand and Nepal, then compare the two. And so what I'd like you to do is to take out a whole sheet of A4 paper. And I want you to leave at least 6 lines per section so that you can add in the basic information about each country. We can then look at the primary and the secondary effects in each country, and we can have a look at the country that we think has been the most effective. So, as I say, draw this table big across the whole of a page of A4. Pause the video to do that, and then come back in a second, and we'll start to get to know New Zealand and Nepal as countries. Okay. So first of all, let's have a look at New Zealand. So New Zealand is what we call a high income country, or a HIC for short. And in 2016, they suffered from a 7.8 magnitude earthquake. Now, the Richter scale only goes up to 10, and that's how we measure earthquakes. So this was a pretty significant one. What we're then going to compare it to is what happened in Nepal, who also suffered a 7.8 magnitude earthquake in 2015. Now, the place that was affected in New Zealand, as I said before, is Kaikoura. And the date that the earthquake happened was the 14th of November, 2016. Now, this is a really, really important fact. The GDP per capita, so the average amount of money that is earned per person in New Zealand, is $40,331. The plate boundary that it sits on is a destructive and a conservative margin. And as I said before, it was a magnitude 7.6 earthquake. Now, if we compare that to Nepal, the place that it happened there was called Gorkha, and it happened on the 25th of April in 2015. Now, we call Nepal a low-income country, a LIC, and the reason being is because they have a GDP per capita of $690 per year. So on average, people there earn $690. Now, that means it is below the threshold to be considered a newly emerging economy, and certainly below the threshold to be considered a HIC. Now, the plate boundary in Nepal is destructive, but the size of their earthquake was also 7.8. It had a 7.8 magnitude. So what I would like for you to do is, using the table that you created earlier, where we had basic information, I would like you to add the key basic information about New Zealand and Nepal. And I want you then to highlight the really key piece here, which is the GDP per capita in each country. Pause the video so that you've got time to do that, and then I'll show you what we're going to do next. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is have a look at the primary and the secondary effects of the New Zealand earthquake. Now, just as a recap, primary effects are the immediate effects of the earthquake. So anything that is caused by the ground shaking and immediately happens would be a primary effect. A secondary effect is something that would happen in the weeks, the months, the years following the hazard. So I'm going to read them through for you. Then what I would like you to do is to pause the video, and for any that you're totally confident on, add them to your table. For any that you think, oh, I'm not quite sure, then hold back, because we'll go through the answers in just a second. So what we've got, 2 people died and 50 people were injured. 100,000 landslides occurred, which blocked major road and rail routes. 10 farms were evacuated after a landslide caused the Clarence River to flood. 60 people needed emergency housing. The total cost of the damage was US dollars 8.5 billion. And a tsunami was triggered, which flooded the land, leaving debris up to 250 meters inland. So pause the video, think it through. Which one of those do you think are primary? Which ones do you think are secondary? And then I'll see you to go through the answers. Okay, so let's go through the answers. Primary effects in the first column, secondary effects in the second one. So primary effects included 2 people died and 50 people were injured. 60 people needed emergency housing. The total cost of the damage was 8.5 billion US dollars. Now give yourself a tick for each of those that you got correct. If there's any that you hadn't added, then add them now. And then let's have a look at the secondary effects. So secondary effects include 100,000 landslides occurred which blocked major road and rail routes. 10 farms were evacuated after a landslide caused the Clarence River to flood. And a tsunami was triggered which flooded the land, leaving debris up to 250 meters inland. Now, if you need to, pause the video to make sure that you've got all these in the correct column. But what I would also like you to do is to highlight those numbers. So 2 people died, 50 people were injured, 60 needed emergency housing, 8.5 billion US dollars damage. Then we've got 100,000 landslides, 10 farms evacuated, and the tsunami. Well done. Okay, now you've done that, you're going to do exactly the same thing for Nepal. So you're going to look through the primary and the secondary effects, and then in the table, categorize them. So have a really good think about which ones were primary and secondary for New Zealand, and then see if you can find almost one that matches it in Nepal. Now, also, while we're doing this, what I want you to think about is, were the effects of this earthquake worse in Nepal, or were they worse in New Zealand? So let's read them through and then over to you. So 9,000 people died and 22,000 people were injured. Landslides were triggered on Mount Everest. This killed 18 people. Many mountain roads were blocked by landslides. This prevented emergency aid to remote areas. 4 million people were left homeless. The total damage was $5 billion. And an outbreak of typhus due to a lack of clean water killed 13 people. Now, typhus is a disease that's spread by dirty water. So pause the video, add these to your table, and then let's go through the answers. Okay, so hopefully some of these were fairly obvious because you can directly compare them to what happened in New Zealand. So 9,000 people died and 22,000 people were injured. 4 million people were left homeless. And the total cost of the damage was $5 billion. Now, then we had, for the secondary effects, landslides were triggered on Mount Everest, killing 18 people. Mountain roads were blocked by landslides, preventing emergency aid to get to remote areas. And an outbreak of typhus due to a lack of clean water killed 13 people. So add those to your table if you need to. And then, as I say, what I really want us to start thinking about is which of those places suffered the most significant impacts. Now, remember, those earthquakes were the same magnitude. They were both 7.8 magnitude. So actually, in theory, if they should have had the same effect. But actually, we know that New Zealand is a hick, an economically developed country, and we know that Nepal is a lick. So actually, we can start to deduce, really, that the effects in one were worse than the other, and that could be linked to the country's economic development. Okay, so what I would like you to do now is this. I would like you to decide in the last column on your table which of those countries had the most significant primary effects and which had the most significant secondary effects. Now, in my opinion, I'm saying it's Nepal, but you may think something different, but I want you to complete that column now. Okay, so what we've been building up to is this question. And this question is a really typical question that you could be asked, which asks you to compare the effects of earthquakes in two countries that have different levels of wealth. So we looked at New Zealand, our high income country. We've looked at Nepal as our low income country. Now remember, we have primary and secondary effects. And once again, this is a sneaky question. So it's compare the effects of earthquakes, it's plural. So it's expecting you to talk about both primary and secondary. Now, to help you, I've broken down how I would answer this question. So if I were you, I would want, in my introduction, to name or state the name of the two countries that you intend to compare and tell the person reading this what their level of wealth is. Then, in paragraph 1, I would compare primary impacts from each country. And then I would compare a secondary impact from each country in New Zealand. And once again, I have given you 2 pointers to get you started. I want you to use low quality housing as your explanation for why Nepal was more affected than New Zealand. And I want you to use more densely populated as your secondary reason for why Nepal was more affected than New Zealand. So pause the video, use the tables that we created, and have a go at answering this question. Okay, so let's go through our answer. I know that that is probably the toughest question that I have asked you to do since we started our work on tectonics. So well done for sticking with it. And let's go through it. Let's see what you got. Now, if you need to make any changes, then don't worry about it. This is just practice. But let's go through it, as I say, in the order that I created it in. So what I wanted was 3 paragraphs. One that was an introduction, one that talked about primary effects, and one that talked about secondary. So in 2016, New Zealand, a HIC, experienced an earthquake of a magnitude 7.8. And in 2015, Nepal, a LIC, experienced an earthquake of the same magnitude. So that's my introduction. Now, the question asked me to compare the effects of an earthquake in 2 places with contrasting wealth. So I've told the person reading this before I've even started, I'm talking about New Zealand and I'm going to be talking about Nepal. And I've also told them that New Zealand is a HIC and Nepal is a LIC. So then, a primary effect of both earthquakes were that people died. In New Zealand, 2 people died, whereas in Nepal, 9,000 people died. This is because in the area of Nepal, the houses were of lower quality. This meant that more buildings collapsed and more people were crushed by the falling debris. Now, what I've got there is I've got my statistics, so my 2 deaths in New Zealand compared to the 9,000 deaths that happened in Nepal. But what's really important is I've added in the reason why that happened. So the fact that the houses were of lower quality meant more of them would have collapsed, and that actually more of them would have killed people because of the falling debris. Okay, now the second paragraph, that's where I'm looking at my secondary effects. So a secondary effect of both earthquakes were landslides. In New Zealand, this resulted in the roads and railways being blocked. However, landslides in Nepal resulted in the death of 18 people. This is because in New Zealand, the area was less densely populated. Therefore, less people were vulnerable to the landslides. So I've linked my explanation to what we talked about earlier on in the session, which is that the area in Nepal was significantly more populated or more densely populated. Now, if you picked some of the other reasons that were on the list or the other effects, that's absolutely fine within your answer. But what I would love for you to do now is to go through and to highlight any of those key facts that you used and any of those connecting words. The reason is it helps it to stand out for you, and it's really, really good practice getting used to using those connectives to show that you are explaining the next step. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our session on the effects of earthquakes in New Zealand and Nepal. Now, this was a biggie because actually you've not only learned a whole new set of facts, but you've also then applied them in a 6-mark question at the end. I'm really proud of you for sticking with this. And what I would say now, what would be really important is to start learning some of those facts and figures off by heart. So, how many people died in New Zealand? 2. How many people died in Nepal? 9,000. Because that allows you to compare the effects of earthquakes in 2 places that are of different contrasting wealth. Right, go through your answers from today, highlight those facts and figures, and then make a commitment to learn them. Maybe cover them up and see if you can call them out loud, or give your sheet to someone in your family and get them to test you on it. But that is, as I say, that is the basis of what is an amazing case study knowledge around New Zealand and Nepal. Right, you've done really, really well. I can't wait to see you in our next session. See you soon.